Well, I'm your host, Michael Avery, and today we're diving into one of the country's most debated and essential entities, the South African Post Office. Now, for many, the Post Office has long been a symbol of both necessity as well as frustration, a vital service provider to millions and a state-owned giant that's really struggled to modernize. But now, under business rescue, the Post Office is at something of a crossroads. Joining me to unpack the progress, the challenges, and the future of the South African Post Office is none other than Anoosh Rooplal, one of the joint business rescue practitioners tasked with steering the ship through what are very turbulent waters, to say the least. From the much-discussed 3.8 billion rand funding gap to questions about the Post Office's relevance in a digital world, we'll explore the untold story behind the work being done to reshape an institution that, quite frankly, I would hate to see hit the wall. The Post Office is as South African as the Springbok. So whether you're a business leader, a policymaker, or just curious about the fate of a service that we've all used at some point in our lifetimes, stick around. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Anoosh, it's great to have you with us today. Maybe you could just start by walking us through the progress that you as a business rescue practitioners have made so far in the Post Office business rescue process. What key milestones have been achieved?
Hello, Michael. Thank you. Good to be here. So as you're aware, the Post Office was placed into business rescue. We published a business rescue plan that was approved and adopted by all creditors. So effectively, that means that, the plan, the approved plan allowed us, became a binding contract between us, creditors and stakeholders that allowed us to put into effect the turnaround or the rescue of the institution. Just in terms of the critical highlights, when we took over, there was we were owing creditors approximately 8.7 billion around July 2023, and through the compromise where creditors agreed to forego 88% of amounts owed to them, and of course payments made to these creditors from the first tranche of funding. We're now sitting with creditors just under 400 million, which for us is an incredible milestone, because this means that the Post Office is now, almost debt free. The other big achievement for us was around the rationalization of the business, cost savings, efficiency seeking, cash preservation, and through all of those initiatives, and which unfortunately did include a retrenchment of some, 4,800 people. We are going to see savings of approximately 1.2 billion rand per year accruing to the Post Office. So in addition to that, we rationalized branches. We're down to 657 branches. And, whilst we have reduced branches, we did not lose our geographic footprint. So, which is excellent for us, and, we through that physical coverage of the country, we cover 90% of the country. And we've got approximately 2,000 postmen on the ground every day. And I think more importantly, we've got operations going, mail moving. Those have been some of the key highlights for us.
Because it's so important that while you do put the business back on sound financial footing, you don't cut so much fat and start cutting into the bone that's necessary for the Post Office to continue going post the business rescue process. What were the initial objectives of the business rescue going back to it, and how has that evolved as you've dealt with those operational and financial realities that you just outlined?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, as mentioned, the Post Office was heavily indebted. It's running, unfortunately, huge gaps where costs exceeded its revenue by up to 250 million to 300 million a month. So it really was bleeding cash flows on a monthly basis. So for us, the initial objectives was to stem the tide, so to speak, to restructure the debt, to remove the debt, which we've done. Obviously then trying to manage the increase in revenues to diversify the revenues of the business. And our plan is really hinged on three key basic elements, if I could put it. There's a lot of detail around it, including a sub-strategy document. But in the main, what creditors voted on was three elements, and that was to stabilize the business, survive, and to future-proof. And the objectives were exactly that. Using the initial tranche of 2.4 billion, we achieved a lot. Through the retrenchments, we now paid through all the retrenchment amounts that were owed to employees. So that's been dealt with. Like I said, we've reduced the debt. We've brought in annual savings. So we're very much on track with achieving those objectives. Until we've hit a stumbling block where the second tranche of the 3.8 billion was not forthcoming.
Mm,
So
mm.
that's where the objectives or the momentum of the business rescue started to slow down.
And we'll come to that, but you mentioned future proofing, and I think that's so critical in understanding how we actually turn what some might call a dinosaur in the post office around and make it future fit in a world that is so digitally, first digitally native now, one could almost say. So maybe you could just share the strategic vision for ensuring the post office remains relevant in such a rapidly digitalizing world.
Yeah, 100%. And I've got to answer this question in two parts because in order to future proof, we needed to take stock of what the post office really has. And it's not just a set of assets on the balance sheet. Yes, we've got properties of 1.7 billion, but the post office is just so much more than that. It's the intangible assets and the potential that is attached to that gives it incredible value, that makes it and it's a set of assets or valuable set of infrastructure assets that's relevant not for the post office only but for government as a whole. And just to unpack that a bit further, this infrastructure set of infrastructure assets includes a couple of things. Like, for example, we have the exclusive license to deliver parcels less than 1 kilogram. We are the designated operator. So, in terms of the Universal Postal Union, the post office is the only entity that can deliver mail in terms of the Universal Postal Union, which is an agency of the United Nations that connects all countries to deliver mail and to treat mail in any country in transit at any point in time. So, adding to that is our ability to connect people through internet connectivity and to roll out infrastructure, electronic infrastructure.
Mm.
And that is through our electronic communication service license and our ECNS licenses that we have. Another valuable element to mention here is that we are the mandated custodian of the National Address Database. And of course, the ability to provide trust services, digital services, these all make for a fantastic um, foundation in order to then future proof the business and to futurize it, so to speak. The property portfolio, again, not just being physical property, but we've got high speed fiber lines and connections to all our post offices, or pretty much over 95% of our post offices. Now, what we then have is a valuable set of physical and digital infrastructure and potential. Now, our strategy talks to exactly that. It talks through the conventional mail services that we're currently doing. We can very easily leverage off this physical and digital infrastructure to provide courier and parcel services, and of course the digital services, as I've mentioned, as well as financial services. Now that's where the value is lying, and that's
Yeah.
what our initiatives are looking to then to future proof.
Yeah, and I mean, what you're talking about is much of it's already sunk capital, and much of it is also legislated in terms of that natural monopoly for sub 1 kilogram parcels as well, which seems to be a fairly compelling strategic value proposition to ensure that funders, and in this case taxpayers, won't be tapped again for further bailouts in the future, and that you can set the post office up on a sustainable, self-sustaining and competitive future path and strategy, which comes back to the funding. And I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding in the media and from what I've read amongst parliamentarians in various committees as well, the need for the 3.8 billion rand. It's been termed a bailout, but really it's post-commencement finance in BRP speak, isn't it? And it's been widely discussed, but as I say, largely misunderstood. So maybe you can clarify how much has been dispersed and how it's going to be utilized. The second tranche that you say is where the stumbling block has now led us to this point.
Yes, Michael, I do agree. It certainly has been there has been a lot of misunderstanding and big misunderstandings of that. So the 3.8 billion is not a request or an ask from the business rescue practitioners. This funding was always this was in the application that was there when it was made to the High Court to place the entity into business rescue. If you recall, it was in liquidation at the time. The application itself made reference to 2.4 billion and 3.8 billion. On that basis, We then also drafted our business rescue plan, which is the only plan that exists that references back to the 2.4 and the 3.8 billion, because this is the funding or the investment that government had committed to make to rescue the post offices for the benefit of all South Africans. And our business rescue plan, like I said, was drafted and adopted on that basis. So it's not a new ask, it's not a new request. That money was always there. It should have come through. And we were, in fact, anticipating receiving this money around March, April of 2024 of this year. And unfortunately, that has not made its way through. And the key elements of this, in terms of, I suppose, how we're going to spend that cash, we can chat about it in a second. But I think what's critical here is that in order to future proof the business against all those advantages that I've mentioned, we need to understand as well that the structural or the environment that we're playing in, the post office has two mandates effectively. It's got a social mandate where we compelled and we have to deliver affordable services to all South Africans, regardless of where they are, whether they're in a rural area or whether they are in an urban area. That is our mandate. We then have a commercial mandate, which we have to diversify the business and earn revenues in order to allow the post office to make revenues and keep itself sustainable so that we don't go back to government for future investment or future funding asks. So that's really the bottom line. And I think that's the investment that we cannot achieve the results without the investment. In order to have growth, you got to invest in the growth. So it would be very unfair for us or anyone else for that matter to be asked to deliver results without the investment.
So, how are you managing to keep the post office operational without that full funding that was initially not even requested but promised as part of the business rescue arriving?
So, unfortunately, we've had to now resort to austerity measures. The funding reserves that we did have could only last for so long. It only gives you so much of runway in a business rescue process. Obviously, we are anticipating receiving that money soon, as I've mentioned, and we've modeled to spend that accordingly. With that now not being in the bank, we effectively had to resort to austerity measures. Unfortunately, we're having to delay or stop certain minor infrastructure enhancements that we need to make. We're now having to manage the processes very tightly. We've been more aggressively chasing up legacy amounts that were owed to the post office, and I'm glad to say that some of that's come through. And as a result of all of these efforts and some large amounts that we owed from some customers and related parties that owed us money, we were able to, pay salaries last month. We've managed to even pay the last tranche of the retrenchment amounts, which are highlighted. And we really are operating on a month-to-month basis. Our funding gap has reduced to approximately 80 to 100 million a month. In other words, our costs are still exceeding our revenue. So we're really managing this very tightly. We are still in this distress mode. We are not out of the woods yet, but that is why it's critical that we get this 3.8 billion. And of course, sorry, one more thing, Michael, we did, amidst the funding not arriving, we then very proactively worked on putting through an application for the TERS benefit again. And that application has been submitted. And we anticipate, hopefully, that if it is approved, and we think there's a good chance of being approved, obviously we wouldn't know for sure, but we could possibly get between 30 and 70% of our monthly payroll subsidized for the next 12 months.
I was going to ask you what might happen if the funding doesn't materialize. Obviously, one hopes that sanity does prevail. Do you have contingency plans to sustain the post office and protect stakeholders if the 3.8 billion doesn't come through?
Well, so unfortunately for now, these are the austerity measures and the interventions that we've put into place. These are the contingencies. The reality is that we need to get those committed funds in. And of course, we will continue to monitor and do cash preservation and cash monitoring, as aggressively as we possibly can. But again, there's only so much runway that the business can have.
For those who might be listening to this and say, no, well, we don't need the post office. The private sector could better manage all of the duties of the post office. Why would you say the post office is still essential? What is the unique value that it brings to the table that the private sector just cannot replicate? Obviously, there's the mandated sub 1 kg parcel delivery and some of the other issues you mentioned. I'm sure you must get this question all the time. Why do we still need the post office?
Yes. So if you look at just communication and why the post office existed, communication is a basic human right. Yes, it was in a physical form, and it's a pity that through past leaderships and the financial turmoil that the post back had going back 12 years, it in fact had a lot of chronic issues, and I can't talk to that, but it's a pity that the post office didn't utilize the chance and the time to modernize when the other post offices globally were modernizing. And so that's the first element that I think it's important to highlight. So we have a moment now. We have the opportunity now, where with the first tranche of funding, the BRPs have achieved so much, right? We have an entity now that is almost debt free, that we could put it back into the hands of government. We've brought cost savings that's going to accrue and is accruing already into the future. And couple that with the digital strategy that I've highlighted in some of the initiatives, highlighting the fact that we used to do Korean parcels. Now we actually, it's so minimal when we can pick up that market share again. We can bring financial services back, and in an improved way and diversify revenue streams. Now all of this is really critical and makes for a base case for why there is relevance. But going back to a more important point, there is a social mandate that we have. And this is where I think if we leave it entirely to the private sector, that our rural areas and people in the far flung areas, the informal economies and the informal townships, those could lead to further exclusion. And that's where competitors, can cherry pick. They don't have to operate in areas where they make losses. They can just focus on their profit making areas. Now, the post office cannot do that. It's got a social mandate. And I think if I look at government's initiatives, its national priorities, it talks through financial inclusion, it talks to digital inclusion. And those are forms of communication where the post office still has relevance and can still keep all South Africans included by providing a multitude of services. I think an important point here is that the post office should be seen as an integrator. If I could just, if it's effectively a strategic infrastructure integrator, because it will allow, it's the only state-owned entity, I believe, that offers 90% of physical coverage across the country, along now with the digital coverage that we want to bring on board, with 2,000 people every day on the ground delivering letters and so on, and with a property portfolio and a national address database. I don't think any other state-owned entity can offer this, because we allow other state entities and government departments to come back into the infrastructure. It would be great because citizens can now collect an ID document, a passport. Any other service that other government departments offer can leverage off this network and this infrastructure.
That's a very compelling proposition. What you're describing is something that is a vital enabler of socioeconomic development. How does the business rescue plan balance the commercial viability with the post office's developmental role? In that you've acknowledged that there are some areas that may be uneconomic to service by the private sector. Are you confident that this new plan will enable enough profitability to help cross-subsidize those other uneconomic areas of your socioeconomic mandate?
Michael, we believe it does. We've put through a very well researched, like I said, sub strategy. It's actually a strategy that supports the business rescue plan. So it's not a sub strategy. Let me correct that. It is a detailed strategy that supports the business rescue plan,
Right.
because there is only one plan. And in the details of the strategy and the financial modeling, yes, we are in distress now. But if we look at the revenues and the enhancements and the diversification of revenues, it does balance out. And it's a 3-year turnaround, which means we achieve break-even of the post office in year 2. Okay. And we believe, and we seeing the numbers and the forecast that talks and shows a post office that can generate revenue on the commercial side to balance out its social mandate side. So that the post office does not have to go back to government for funding into the future. There's all of these possibilities and potential, and that's the word, the amazing potential that exists with the infrastructure that we have, and that we have to further enhance. We got to get it to an acceptable state with this 3.8 billion, so that other public and private partners can come in and leverage off this network.
Often it comes down to leadership and public perception in these processes as well. I think just in the main, business rescue as a process often faces criticism for perceived delays or perceived lack of transparency. I know lots of BRPs and I know the constraints that you operate under, and it's very difficult to manage what you can disclose and what you can't divulge. How are you managing public and stakeholder expectations in the process?
Yeah, so there's a couple of oversight functions that exist. So I'll start with just oversight function by the National Treasury and our shareholder. So there's a monitoring task team that's established, and there's a regular monthly meeting where the BRPs have to account on the status of the business rescue. And that's obviously attended. We have to present, and there's various questions asked around the business rescue process. We then have monthly reporting to our creditors, which we are obliged to do in terms of the Companies Act. The Companies Act governs the entire business rescue process, and those are published on our website. I think what's important is as well is our ongoing discussions with our employee representatives. There's an employee committee that was set up at the start of the business rescue, and there's ongoing dialogue and consultation with those employee representative groups. And of course, we try and manage providing updates, valuable information to the media as well on where we are in the process.
I think one area of skepticism revolves around leadership in state-owned enterprises, and we've seen, especially during the state capture years, how boards were repurposed to serve a particular nefarious agenda. How has your team worked to rebuild trust and demonstrate accountability during the business rescue process, and what would allay concerns around leadership in any kind of repurposed entity to take this plan forward in a way that's sound from a governance and an ethical and a capacity perspective?
Thank you. So in terms of the Companies Act, the full powers of the board and management vests in the business rescue practitioners. In this case, it's Juanito Diamonds and myself. So there are no board members. I believe all of them had resigned at the time, by the time we had gotten there. So we just have one executive director, and she works very closely, and she's our current acting CEO that works closely with the BRPs. But we act as the accounting authority, the final authority. And for us right now, that's very positive in the sense of allowing us the agility to implement the business rescue plan. However, a business rescue is, and I think you've alluded to this, yes, we are not meant to be there forever. We are temporary custodians and stewards in order to turn around the entity. And that's the one thing that we do take seriously, because we believe that if a business rescue does take too long, it also then starts acting, contrary to value that you create. So what we have identified and what we have put into place is a new organizational structure, a whole new, executive structure that look at different leadership that's required in the post office. One of them being a chief digital officer, which we haven't appointed as yet, as well as a COO, a chief operating officer, that has strong experience in logistics, in parcels, in financial services, in digital inclusion aspects. So those are two examples of key executive roles that we've created that didn't, or the one that didn't exist, and that was a chief digital officer. So by the time we exit as business rescue practitioners, the plan is to work with our shareholder to put in a new board so that they could bring in and appoint new board members in order to then take this strategy going forward once we then leave or discharge the business rescue process.
And I think that's a very important point, Anoosh, is that it's not just a question of saying, right, our job is done, this is where it ends. It's a transition, it's a managed transition to ensure that you're passing the baton over to very capable board members and a newly constituted board that understands the strategy that you and Juanita have now put in place and implemented, hopefully with that 3.8 billion arriving sooner rather than later. If we just to zoom out in all of this, and it's fascinating because of the fact that it's a state-owned enterprise, because it's such a nationally important asset. What lessons have you learned from the Post Office's challenges that you think could be applicable to other state-owned entities in South Africa?
Yes, so I think it's certainly around efficiencies. We have seen that, I think one of the key things is that these are state-owned assets, and an asset has got to be treated and maintained in order to extend the longevity of it.
Mm.
I think what we have seen is the neglect in this scenario of assets, which again, if it was curtailed or even invested, minimum investment just to maintain it, you actually get a lot of mileage out of it. And that's the unfortunate aspect of it. And that's where we've seen the core infrastructure now, in the post office instance, degrade, and we've had unfortunate maintenance issues. And yes, if you walk into post office, that's not great. But that is why we need the 3.8 billion. And I think that's a very important lesson. By just maintaining what we have, you can extend the lifespan of a lot of our state-owned assets.
Gosh, I wish we could apply that to all of our state-owned assets, Anush. I think that is so important. And I've got to ask you, just as a concluding thought, I mean, if you had a magic wand to change one structural issue facing the post office today, what would it be? Would it just be to get that 3.8 billion?
Right now, yes, I think for us, we need if I could have a wand, the 3.8 billion is what we would need, because it literally allows us to complete um, the rest of our business rescue plan. And we are so far down the line with such great momentum. It would be a pity that if the funding doesn't come in, all of these gains would be eroded, would be lost, and we'd lose such a valuable set of state assets.
Mm.
If the entity were to go into liquidation, because we don't think about that, we don't want it to go into liquidation. But if it were, what typically happens in that scenario is that all your property is sold off at fire sale values. Employees all lose their jobs, all of that, and you effectively destroy a lot of value. So in a business rescue, these assets are preserved. It's back into the hands of government. And if you look at the 3.8 billion, let's just chat about that for a second. In fact, we have the only obligation we have to pay now is the 18 cents, a second dividend to certain class of creditors. And that's for circa 500 million. Once we do that, we're in a position where we've actually, to a large extent, are able to discharge our business rescue plan, because the rest of the money really is earmarked for 2 billion of that, approximately just over 2 billion of that is earmarked for capital spend or infrastructure upgrades. And we need 1 billion rand for working capital that allows the post office to continue trading. It provides certainty to its customers, its suppliers, its employees. It takes away all of these uncertainty that exists now amongst our stakeholders. So yeah, if I had a magic wand, I'd want that 3.8 billion just to really put the post office on a steady state back
Yeah.
again.
Yeah, and to give it a fighting chance. But I've got to ask you, and you've got no crystal ball. Do you think Treasury, are you confident that Treasury is going to advance the 3.8 billion from what you've seen and discussed with Treasury? Because ultimately, the decision, as I understand, rests with National Treasury.
Yes, it certainly does. And look, I do appreciate the challenges that the fiscus is having in terms of balancing out the finances for the entire country. It certainly does rest with them. Um, Look, as from our perspective as business rescue practitioners, we've had huge successes. We are very happy with the success that we've achieved to date. And yeah, it'll be a pity if that's undone. Like I said, it's very difficult for me to comment. In fact, in terms of the strategy, the details on the strategy, that's also been submitted, to our shareholder and National Treasury. So the ball is in their court.
Well, that's a wrap for today's episode of Business Rescued. A huge thank you to Anoosh Rooplal for joining us and shedding light on the complex and vital work happening at the South African Post Office. It's clear that while challenges abound, there's also a vision, there's a strategy, and one that could see South Africa's Post Office redefined and repurposed for a new digital-first era. As always, these discussions are just the tip of the iceberg. Until next time, this is Michael Avery reminding you that every challenge is actually an opportunity for reinvention, and I certainly hope we don't let this prized national asset slip into the dustbin of history. I'm confident that everyone will come to their senses as we've just heard. A really compelling strategic vision has been placed on the table, and it is now over to the adults at Treasury who ultimately will have the final word. Take care.